Hello all, welcome to the first training tutorial for JMeter. So finally we have begun learning JMeter after learning Selenium and Java. So let's see what we are going to see in this tutorial. We will have an introduction to JMeter. We will see what we can test with JMeter, how we can download JMeter, how we can start JMeter, and couple of elements of a JMeter test plan. So let's see what is JMeter. So if you have been working with the field of software testing for say 1 year or 2 years or some more time, then you may have probably heard of performance testing, which is used to find out how application behaves or how well application functions when it is subjected to a to a specified number of users. So you may have 100 users clicking submit button on a form, and then how application behaves. So in these situations you may have defects which are revealed, which we may not usually, well, we definitely cannot usually find them with just functional testing of one user testing an application on a web browser. But since it is also not practical to test an application with hundreds of users, this is where we use tools like JMeter. So JMeter is a performance testing tool. Now coming to what we can test with JMeter, of course we can test the performance of web applications, that is HTTP as well as HTTPS, but we can also test the performance of web services, for example RESTful services, or we can also test the database performance using JMeter. There are a couple of more examples of using JMeter, but I will stick to only these for time being. Now, how we can download JMeter and start it. So you can download JMeter from the URL which I have mentioned here, or you can just Google JMeter download, and Google is intelligent enough to direct you to the first right download link. So once you have downloaded JMeter, then you can start it using the following command. So I have my JMeter in this directory, desktop Apache JMeter. I'm using version 2.12, Apache JMeter 2.12, and then I go to bin directory. So after this, if I list the files which are there here, since I'm on Windows, I will be using a batch file which is jmeter.batch. So I just write jmeter.batch and it will start JMeter. Alright, there's a warning, but we can just ignore it. And this is how JMeter looks like when it is started. So this is GUI of JMeter. It is written in Java. So this is how it looks like. And then we have two elements here on left hand side, which are test plan and workbench. Workbench has nothing special, just name and comment. Test plan. Okay, now let's begin with learning the few elements of JMeter. So we see, yeah, test plan first. So test plan is something which encompasses or which contains all of the elements of a test, which we would have a look at in a few moments. But what do we have in test plan? So we have name in test plan. We can change this name, we can enter some comments, we can define some variables. We will see these variables in future session. We can also say how to run thread groups. We will see thread groups in a while, but for now let's assume that thread group is the number of users. So for example, I can say right click, add thread group. So I can define how many users I have to run my test with, and this is one setting for thread group in the test plan. So I can say run all my thread groups consecutively, and then I can also say run tier down thread groups. For example, when adding the thread group, I can say a particular thread group is a tier down thread group. So this is a setting for tier down thread group. And then we have a checkbox for functional testing mode. If we check this checkbox, JMeter will store all of the data it receives from server for the request which we are sending. But if we check this, then it will generate lots of data as well, and it may affect the performance of JMeter itself. So usually we should not check this. There are other ways to verify the performance, verify the functionality of application, for which we have assertions, which we will have a look today as well as in the future session. All right. Let's ignore other elements for now. So these are the most important features of the test plan. Now let's see what else we have. Alright, so let's begin with the thread group now. So when we have a test plan, we also have to define how many users we want to run our test with. How do we do that? Just right click on our test plan, say add and thread users, and just select thread group. Alright, so this is a thread group. You can give it a name here and the comment. And now we have some settings here. Let's see them. So first setting is action to be taken after a sample error. So if there's an error, we can say continue or start next thread. Thread is nothing but the user here. It's more technical term. In more colloquial world, we can say it's number of users, or we can say stop the thread or stop the test, etc. Now we have couple of more properties, thread properties or user properties. So here we can define how many users we want to run our test with, what is the ramp up period. Ramp up period is something which defines how long it takes for test to reach all number of users. For example, if I say 10 here and if I say 10 seconds as ramp up period, it means that I would have all users up and running in 10 seconds. Okay, loop count is how many times it is to be looped, and then we can also delay the thread creation if needed. We have a scheduler here. Let's see what happens there. If we select a scheduler, then we can define the start time and end time of the test. So test will not be run immediately. As soon as we click the run button, it will start running only at the specified time, and it would finish at the given end time. And then we have something called duration of the test. So we can define duration here, which means it will override the end time. So if we have end time more than duration, then test will get over as soon as duration is reached. And then we can also delay the test initiation. Alright, let's see what we have next. Okay, so we have something called controllers now. Controllers are something which we would be using more and more in coming session. For now, let's see that we have two types of controllers. We have sampler and logical controller. So let's see an example of sampler. But what is a sampler? So sampler is something which is used to sample the request. For example, in case of web application, we can send an HTTP request. You can imagine that it is similar to a browser sending HTTP request, but only in this case we do not have a browser. So how do we add a sampler? Just right click on a thread group, say add, and then we have something called sampler here. So we have lots of samplers here, but for now we will learn how to add HTTP request sampler. So this is my HTTP request sampler. So I can give it a name here, comments, server name, that is the address, and the path. If we have path to the server, for example google.com// some other path, we can give that. If we want to send some parameters, then we can define them here, etc. So these forms are sampler called HTTP request. Next, what we have config element. So we can also define some configuration with the sampler. For example, if we want to run tests with different data sets, then what we can do is we can define a config element. So I can use CSV dataset here. You can compare this approach similar to the data externalization, which we saw in say Selenium test, that we do not hardcode data there if we have to run same test with different data set. And here also we do not have to duplicate HTTP request again and again for each data set. We can just define the CSV data set here, file name, file encoding, and couple of other options which we would see in future session. And this is the data which we can pass to HTTP request. So CSV dataset config is a data configuration here. And then we have other data configuration, other config elements also. For example, HTTP request default. So let's see that. I can right click on this, and then I can add another config element which is HTTP request default. For example, if we have lots of HTTP requests, which we would definitely have in a load test, then we cannot keep duplicating server and port number here, because if we duplicate here and if there is a change in the server name or port number, then we will have to modify it in each HTTP request, and this is just not feasible. So we can define we can define the server name and port number in HTTP request default, and then we can have this being used in HTTP request. So when our server changes, we do not have to modify all HTTP requests. We can just modify HTTP request default. Alright, let's see another config element. We have HTTP cookie manager. So we should add HTTP cookie manager. Well, we can add HTTP cookie manager at the thread group level. So I have HTTP cookie manager here. So this comes, if you have a look here, this comes at the thread group level, which means that now JMeter will store all of the cookies. By default, it will not. So this is one more thread group element. And then we have something called listener. Listener is used to save the results. If we do not add any listener, then JMeter, we will not have any way to see, the outcome of test. So how do we add listener? I can add listener at the thread group level. So I can say add listener. I can say view results in table. So this is a listener. So listener is something which listens, or we can say that it is to view a test report. All right, and then what we have, logical controller. Okay, so we saw a couple of example of, well, we saw one example of sampler and couple of config elements. Now let's see what we have in logical controller. But what is logical controller? So logical controller is used to control, well, as its name indicates, controls the logic of the test. So if we use logical controller, then we can let JMeter know that how it has to process our, say for example, samplers, and we can also indicate it to JMeter that if we need any modifications in those sampler. So let's see a couple of logical elements. So I have a logical element here called yeah, once only controller, which means that a request would be run only once, and we can give a different name here, we can enter comment here, and then if I add a sampler here, for example HTTP request, which is here, it means that this request will be run only once by a thread, not more than that. I can also do one thing, if I want my previous request to also be controlled only once, and if all of my data set is right, then I can just drag it here, and this also becomes part of only once controller, isn't it? That's very easy. And if I think that my first HTTP request, second HTTP request does not have to be in only once only controller, then I can just drag it out to thread group. So it goes out now. All right, and then I can also have something called interleave controller. Interleave controller is something which is used for interleaving. That is, if I have a use case wherein I have to run one request, then I have to run another request, then third request, then I have to repeat a request, then I can use interleave controller. Let's see it by an example. Okay, so we have a sample here in which we have a test plan, we have thread group, we have once only controller. So we have seen these elements so far, and then we have login request, which is HTTP request. So login request is something which, as its name indicates, would be used to log in, and it would be executed only once. Then we are loading search page, and then we have interleave controller. In the interleave controller, we have HTTP sampler A, HTTP sampler B. It means when test runs, then interleave controller will search A, then it will load the search page, then it will run search B, and then it will load the search page. Then we have HTTP default request, which we can use to, as I said earlier, define the domain name, etc. And then we have HTTP default request at the thread group also, and then we have a cookie manager. Let's try to replicate it. So let's try to delete everything. Alright, I delete everything. So how we can remove it? Let's remove it from here. Yes. Alright, so I'll say, okay, I won't change its name. I'll say add thread group. Okay, so let it be thread group, and now we have to add once only controller. So I add once only controller, and its name is once only controller, and then let's add one HTTP sampler. HTTP sampler. Is here. So let's give it the same name. I will just say login request. So we have not defined any other property. We are just trying to set up one sample test here without any other property. And then we have another HTTP sampler, which is outside once only controller. So let's add it at the thread group. Sampler HTTP request, and let's name it load search page. So I just changed its name. Alright, so it is refreshed now. And then we have an interleave controller. So I come here again, and then I have a logical controller, and then I have interleave controller. And then in interleave controller we have two HTTP sampler, so which are to perform search on two terms, say search A and B. So let's add sampler HTTP request. So I will just say search A. Alright, it is refreshed now, and then I will say logical not logical controller sampler HTTP request, and then I name it search B. Alright, so this is also refreshed now. So now we have an HTTP default request also. So we add one config element, HTTP default request. Yep, so it comes here. So we can define properties of server name, etc. here, or some parameters here. Alright, and at last there is one more default request here. Let's not add that, and then we have a cookie manager. So let's add cookie manager here, which is at the thread group level. So this is the cookie manager. Now how the test would be run. So let's go back to our thread group. So let's say we want to run it with 10 users, and the amper period is 100 seconds. It means in every 10th second we would have one user up and running. And now once only controller would make sure that for one thread the login request is executed only once. And then we have load search page, and then we have search A. So search A is performed. Now since we have Interleaved Controller, so we have search A done, then it loads the search page, then we have search B done, then it loads the search page, and then rest of the elements are the config properties. So this is how we can define a simple test plan. But if you see the HTTP requests are empty, we have not defined anything here. So it's not really a test plan as such. It's just a dummy structure right now. But since it is an introduction session, we know now how we can what are the different elements, what is a test plan, what is a thread group, what kind of controllers we have. We saw we have sampler and logical controllers, and we saw a couple of config elements, and we also saw how we can create a skeleton or a structure of a test plan. So probably in the next session or in the future sessions we would also have a valid test plan with more HTTP request with some data in those HTTP requests, and then we could run the test plan and have some results being given to us. So this brings us to an end of this session. So hope you enjoy watching the first part of JMeter training, and you stay tuned for future sessions. And if you enjoy watching this video, then please click the thumbs up. Thank you. Bye bye. Happy learning.